driven home to me I was very ill at one point, and I was in the hospital, and they gave me all sorts of drugs to try to help me. And it was a physical illness that I had, and they didn't know what it was, so they were throwing everything at me to try to save my life. I was quite close to death, and in a lot of discomfort. And all this cocktail of drugs sort of soaked into me somehow, and produced this tremendous despair. I had this terrible sense of despair, and it was sort of soaking every part of my mind. I noticed it was when they injected a particular anti-nausea drug, which they had to give me to try and keep down all the other things they were giving me. There was a terrible despair that would come for the next sort of 4 to 6 hours. Anyway, it even infected those parts of my mind that reframe a challenging situation. So I don't know if you do this, but sometimes if I'm going through a difficult time or a difficult situation, I'll say to myself, well, it could be worse. And I'll try to think of something that could be worse than what I'm having. And, there are a lot of things often that I can imagine in that situation. I think of other places in the world, other people, other situations that are worse. And I think, gosh, I guess it's not so bad after all. Try to reframe, right? Even my reframing apparatus in my mind seemed to be soaked with despair. I couldn't get it off the ground. So it became very intense. And bear in mind, I was also quite close to dying as well, which tends to heighten things a bit. And it was unbearable. And I recognized that, or rather what happened then, there was this sort of I was squeezed from both sides. When I thought about the past, about how things were much better in the past when I wasn't in hospital almost dying, it became unbearable. I couldn't even add that extra load of yearning for the past. And when I thought of the future and wondering, will I ever get better? What's going to happen next? Because there was a great deal of confusion at that time. They didn't know what was going on. Looking ahead, what's going to happen to me? Will I ever be well again? Oh, this sort of those two activities were adding so much strain to the situation that I couldn't sustain them. And because of the intensity of the situation, I was kind of squeezed by nature into the present moment, if you like. And this mantra came in my mind, a kind of spontaneous, repetitive phrase came in my mind, which is, now I'm okay. Now I'm okay. Which wasn't a comforting thing, like saying, you're okay, you're okay. It was a recognition that actually at that moment I was fine. I couldn't stand it another second. I couldn't stand it for 5 more seconds. I couldn't bear it for 5 more seconds, but I could bear it now. I could bear it now, right now, right now. Right now is fine. And I recognized I was actually completely fine in all of that discomfort. Right now I was fine. Right now I was fine. Of course, in that right now, went on for a long time. But the point is, as I pointed out with the balancing exercise, that all I could handle was right then and there. And there was this sense of kind of unification of my observer with the observed, a little bit like an oscilloscope with 2 waves of an oscilloscope coming into a kind of consonance with each other. And there was a sort of a subject-object kind of merging that occurred at that time, which took away all the suffering. I was sort of squeezed into it, It's a little bit like I watched your video about your 5-MeO DMT, your transformative experiences you had with that. And, it reminds me a bit of that, because I suppose your 5-MeO DMT experience, once you'd taken that, it was nature in charge, right? You were squeezed by nature into this transformative experience that you had. Well, this was a bit similar, except it wasn't psychedelic. It was sort of being very, very close to death and so on. So I had a lot of strange experiences around that time, because I was close to death for quite some time and had a lot of very, very strange experiences. That's one of them. It's sort of relevant to movement car method. So we look at different things in the body, playful, easy, joint nourishing, body nourishing movements with a twist. And that twist is this investigative or questioning aspect. And I find that if you can learn something in the body, you have an experience in the body, it very easily percolates up to the mind. Sometimes it's hard. You can learn a concept, an idea, but without an embodied sense of having experienced it, then it can be hard to apply or to recognize, or one's still interpreting that lesson or context or concept through one's current position. But a learning of the body has a different kind of effect. So when we learn in the body like that, the things we learn, the principles we learn, it seem to bubble from the bottom up. And then you can recognize all these different applications of things we learn. So that's the sort of thing that movement calm is about.
Yeah, I'm glad I asked that question because so much came out. And there's a lot of just the fascinating about the actual practice, and how actually releasing tension, you start to feel more fatigue. Like that's very counterintuitive. I wouldn't have expected that. So that's a very interesting element. And I was just kind of trying to feel into what you were saying with the practice, and I can see how like there's all this sensitivity in the body and all these things that happen when we do certain physical activities, and there's all this tension that obscures us from that sensitivity or protects us from feeling our bodies and feeling life more. And it's the same thing. And then you related it back to meditation, which is also interesting. And then I was really kind of struck by your story about being close to death. And I guess I'm curious how long ago this was, because this seems like it's a pivotal event. And then it also seems like maybe that was kind of an awakening experience. That's what I'm getting from what you're saying, with kind of just the subject and the object merging.
It was a moment of learning, I would say. I wouldn't say it wasn't a moment of awakening. It was a moment of learning, learning quite deeply. And because it was quite protracted, it went on for some time. It was a learning that had some time to, bed in, I suppose. But actually, the more profound experience at that time happened before that. So I would, seeing as you're asking about pivotal moments, I suppose, should I tell the story?
Sure, please do.
Well, I to cut a long story short, I had internal bleeding that due to something I was born with, a genetic, I won't say defect, because it's 2022. Can I say variation? A special defect. I was special, Artem. But anyway, the specialness that I had, my particular specialness, was so I'm cutting now to the chase. There's a longer way I could tell the story when I didn't know what it was and all this sort of thing, but never mind that. So I hadn't had any problems with this up until this moment. My intestines had a cul-de-sac of stomach tissue. I've been born that way. So sort of normal intestine, then sort of cul-de-sac of stomach tissue. And of course, stomach tissue should be in the stomach. It shouldn't be this little cul-de-sac coming off, or a little pouch, I suppose, coming off of your intestine. So anyway, usually they catch it when you're a kid. It's called Meckel's diverticulum. And so one day, a little over 10 years ago, to answer your other question, it switched on as stomach tissue and started to produce stomach acid. And that stomach acid, of course, in the stomach is okay, but in the intestines, it's not so good. So it created an internal bleeding in my intestines, right? No pain, though. No pain from that. And I started to, should we say, void massive amounts of blood, right? But black tar, the actual pouch was quite high up in my intestinal tract. So when you bleed internally from low down, it looks like blood, it's red. But when you bleed from higher up in your gastrointestinal tract, it comes out kind of black. And it's a substance called melena. And because it's been somewhat partially digested on the way down, right? Anyway, and it smells really bad. I'll tell you that. Anyway, so all this started coming out. I went to the doctor and they said, "Oh, did you eat a lot of licorice and all this sort of thing?" So I went through this whole thing. So it took me about 10 days to get, or 7 or 8 days to get to the hospital, because this doctor was kind of telling me I was fine. All this while, what happens when you lose a lot of blood is you lose also red blood cells, and red blood cells are what transport the oxygen from your lungs, I guess, to the cells, right, of your body. So if you lose a lot of blood like that, you can't get the oxygen that you're breathing in to oxygenate the body. It can't get transported in that way. So I started suffocating, but on a sort of cellular level. I could still breathe, but it wasn't, oxygenating the body very well. So I became very weak, and there was still bleeding going on, and I became very weak. And, my friends had to carry me up the stairs of my apartment, this sort of thing. It was really interesting. Towards the end, I said to myself, okay, if I can get to the toilet, go to the bathroom, and come back again, I was in my bed, then, which was about, I don't know, like 15, 20 feet maybe, then I will wait till the morning to go to the hospital because I was getting worse and worse. If I can't, then I'll go to the hospital, like the ER. And so I tried to lift my head up off the pillow and it fell back. It got to the point then where I couldn't even get out of bed. Previously, in order to get to the bathroom, I had to take 1 or 2 stops. But now I couldn't even lift my head. So my brother, who I lived with at the time, we shared an apartment in London, called the ambulance. And they came. Took me to the ER. We call it the A&E, but it's the ER. And they were rushed. I was rushed in there. And I rushed in, the nurse looked at me, and suddenly everything came alive, and I was taken to there's different degrees of ER, right, depending on how badly messed up you are. I went to the serious one, right? And I went to the one where suddenly, it's great, actually, you get to go to the front of the queue, and everyone is, looking after you and trying to, but anyway, it's not good because the reason you're there is very bad, of course. So I was there, and they said, we're going to have to do an emergency blood transfusion, all this sort of stuff. And they said, so if you should have about 14 to 16, I think, red blood cell count as an adult male. People start dying around 7. I was down to 4. My heart was maxed out, max BPM. There is apparently a BPM your heart can go that's sort of its max. My heart was at the max, and it had been at the max for a while. I was very fit at that time, and younger, and more handsome, sadly. But anyway, never mind. That's age for you. And so I'd managed to survive. And up till then, my brother left the booth, the little booth you're in the ER, to call my parents to tell them what was happening. And the doctor said, don't go. He's probably not going to make it. So I heard that. And when I heard that, it was like someone pulled the plug on one of those old TVs, those old cathode ray tube TVs where you turn them off and they go boo to a white dot. And everything went to like switched off. And then I saw before me kind of like like someone's riffling a deck of cards, my life go by. And I had this sense of completeness and perfection. Not that I'd done everything perfectly right, but that everything had to have gone the way it went. So that was the sense of the feeling, right? So this sort of it was literally like someone was riffling from one side to the other. My life, right there. And then I saw a kind of Zen painting. Those Zen things where they do sort of calligraphy in a very kind of Zen way, right? The way they do it is sort of expression of their Zenness, I suppose. I saw a Zen brush just paint a diagonal line down, and it had that sense of spontaneity as well. So there's a sense of perfection, but then also a sense of spontaneity. Anyway, I could go into that, but that's enough for now, I think. And then I felt my body again, and I experienced my body, and I experienced the body's will to live. And I experienced that the body I had the sense that the body was a sort of series of interconnecting patterns, in a sense, that had its own momentum, and that when that momentum was over, the patterns would sort of, the strands of the rope of the body's being would sort of dissipate, lose their coherence, dissipate into, as elements do when you die, I guess, into other things. And I recognized then, that's the will to live. The body's going to keep living until it can't live anymore. It's like a candle. A candle, when you light a candle, it burns all the way down. It doesn't look at the bottom and go, uh-oh, almost out of wax, I better burn more slowly. When you burn a candle, it goes all the way down, unless you blow it out, all the way down, all the way. Full commitment, you could say. So I experienced that. And then my mind came back on, or my sort of personality, if you like, came back on. And I experienced also the mind, um, its momentum as well. And then my mind was going to keep going until it ran out of momentum, yeah. And it would also sort of unravel at the end there. And then I recognized that I was going to, so I kind of let the mind and body. Well, I think a lot of people give up when they're faced with death or something like that, because in a sense, we're afraid to really try to survive in case we can't. There's almost a sense in which we can't quite face the situation. And it's possible, because to face the situation means to acknowledge its possible outcome, which, as you pointed out earlier, is death, right? So in a way, in refusing, we won't even rise to it, you know? Anyway, so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to let my mind and my body. I mean, I didn't think this exactly, but this was, I'm trying to put words on the position I arrived at, which was that I'm going to let, my mind and my body are just going to keep doing what they do until they die. And if they die, that's fine. Didn't seem like it was a big problem. But at the same time, I wasn't going to die a moment earlier than I had run out of momentum in those structures. I wasn't going to die a moment earlier than there was nothing left to wring out of it. That was the sense. That's what the will to live. That's what the will to live feels like. When it's not inhibited by an unwillingness to face death, basically the possibility of death. You know. Anyway. So then suddenly my eyes came back online. You know, I could see suddenly what was going on. I looked around and looked at the curtains, you know, there's in the floor and so on they have. And the curtains in the floor were me. In the sense that the thing that, you know, that was watching the mind and watching the body and all this sort of thing, it's not exactly quite right, but the division between inside, outside, etc., was gone. So it was like it was me. The floors were me, or I was, or at least they weren't not me. Something like this. Perhaps hard to. Maybe I'm describing it poorly. So that was quite profound and really rather life-changing, I would say. Anyway, and then it was in the aftermath of that when they started to give me these transfusions. They didn't know why I was losing a lot of blood. They thought all these kind of things it might be. Anyway. Ended up being this, as I said, this stomach tissue cul-de-sac, which some months later they were able to simply vivisect, to cut out. And then it doesn't grow back or anything like that. So I was very lucky that there were a long list of really nasty things that it could have been. And that's why they're throwing everything in the book at me. But then it ended up being this thing at the bottom, which is really, really rare. And it's definitely not that. But it ended up being that. Yeah, so then they were so luckily, some months later, they simply cut that bit out, and it hasn't bothered me since. But anyway, it was in the aftermath of that, in the days and week after that I was in the hospital, still quite close to dying in those next hours, that this other experience that I mentioned to you about being squeezed from out of the past and out of the future into something, you know, was happening. So that's we've sort of reversed our way into that story.
yeah, inside out. Thank you so much for sharing that. That like shook me up, and it really sounds like that was a near-death experience. And you know, you say that it's learning an experience of learning, not an experience of awakening. You did say though that that somehow changed your life. So I'm curious, how did it change your life going forward?
Well,
if you could put it in words, even.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, of course, there are some things one can't say, but I can't put into words. But I found it oriented. It seemed like more or less everything. So coming out of that experience, I noticed that everything was upside down and different. So I reacted to things differently. Things that bothered me before didn't bother me anymore. Other things I was more sensitive to. So it seemed like all the pieces had been moved around somehow inside. And this sort of feeling, this sort of seeing through a certain fixed view that I hadn't even recognized I had. of separateness, perhaps, as they say, right? Um, meant that everything uh, had to be, in a way, relearned. So I had to discover who I was, I suppose, or rather, reacclimatize. That's a better way of saying it. I had to acclimatize to that new um, unmooring from that fixed view. So I found that that was the case, and so I was also very, very drawn. So previously, I'd enjoyed reading about the things I like to read about changed. Actually, I was perhaps more interested in reading about, achieving this or achieving that. Suddenly, that changed, and I was resonating with other things, and so I spent the next couple of years actually. I lived in a part of London near Greenwich Park, right next to Greenwich Park, which is a lovely park in London. And I went there and I found this oak tree. And I would sit under that oak tree. So for some months, I sort of had to recover a bit, and then I had the surgery later on, and I had to recover from that. So I was kind of not, should we say, my physical, peak in terms of I had to do a lot of recovery essentially. So I would go to the park. Was still able to work, but I would go to the park and sit. I still, worked for myself at those days, so I had a lot of time. I go to the park and I just meditate under this big oak tree, and I'd sit there, and it was very strange. The sorts of strange experiences I would have there. I was drawn to meditation there, and I have a lot of strange kind of meditation style experiences there. I'd spend a lot of time sitting there. So I'd sit for about an hour, and then I'd do, say, 20 minutes of yoga. And then I'd sit for an hour and do 20 minutes of yoga, and sit for an hour, and then do, get up and then go and get a coffee at the Pavilion Cafe in the top of the park. And then I'd come back down again, and I'd sit, and I'd just sit there for hour upon hour upon hour upon hour, day after day after day after day. And if it was raining, which it often does in the UK, I had this green poncho, which I used to wear. I'd sit there in the rain as well, not getting wet, of course, because with the poncho I didn't get wet, and I just was drawn there. It seemed, So I had this long period of meditating almost all the time that I wasn't doing anything else, which was a lot of the time. In those days, my primary occupation was as a musician. So musicians have strange hours, and how it is with musicians. You're on the gig, you're off the gig, etc. You often have the day free. Certainly, you have the day free. So I would spend a lot of the day in there, so in the park. That's one of the ways it changed things. It changed my life a lot. It made things a lot more fluid and a lot more, a lot less tangible in a way, a lot less fixed.